Ano ang naging epekto ng pandemya sa iyong pamumuhay? Sapat ba ang iyong kinikita sa pang-araw-araw na gastusin? Natutugunan ba ang iyong mga pangangailangan sa kalusugan?
Hindi ko narinig.
Ano ang mga serbisyo at programa na dapat pagtuunan ng mga susunod na lider para mas bumuti at umangat ang pamumuhay ng mga Pilipino? Sa tumitinding kahirapan na mas pinalala pa ng pandemya, paano nga ba maiaahon ang kabuhayan ng bawat Pilipino? Pamumuhay ng May Dignidad para sa lahat. A webinar on National Social Protection Floor. Bahagi ng #Pilipilunas 2022 webinar series ngayong March 14, alas 9:30 ng umaga.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Veronica Baloy Jimenez, a broadcast journalist, and I will be your moderator for this morning. Welcome to our Pilipilunas 2022 webinar, Pamumuhay Nang May Dignidad para sa Lahat, a webinar on the National Social Protection Floor. We are now live streaming on the UP Diliman #Pilipilunas 2022, UP SIDS, and UP Diliman Facebook page. The webinar is organized by the UP Diliman Task Force Nation Building, an initiative of the UP Diliman Office of the Chancellor, co-presented by DZUP 1602 and the Diliman Information Office. So please check out our social media sites. They're flashing it on your screen, or they flash it on your screen. So that, and please also don't forget to use #Pilipilunas 2022. All right. Our opening remarks will be given by the 11th Chancellor of the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Please welcome Chancellor Fidel Nemenzo.
Thanks, Veronica. Magandang umaga sa inyo lahat. Good morning to all. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on the National Social Protection Floor. Ito po ay bahagi ng Pilipilunas 2022, Pagbangon at Pagsulong tungo sa Magandang Buhay at Bukas. This is a series of roundtable discussions on governance and development issues organized by the UP Diliman Task Force Nation Building under the Office of the Chancellor. Now allow me to introduce this webinar series. Pilipilunas 2022 is our university's response to two imperatives of the times. The first imperative is the COVID-19 pandemic, which has exposed the vulnerabilities of the Philippine state and development pattern. The crisis, the economic and health crisis brought about by the pandemic, is a reminder of the need to strengthen state capacity, especially in the delivery of health and other social services on one hand, and to deepen and broaden the domestic foundations of growth. Now, the second imperative for the webinar series is the coming national and local elections and the turnover of political power to a new, if not different, set of leaders. You know, national elections are always deeply consequential, but these 2022 electoral exercises come in the midst of a deep existential crisis that has heightened debates on policy issues and political platforms. And the reason why we respond to these imperatives is because nation building has always been at the core of our university's mission. We were founded behind the idea that a modern nation needs the contributions of its citizenry, and that the National University, with its threefold mandate of teaching, research, and public service, is perhaps the central institution delivering on this need. Last year, we formed the task force on a blueprint for building the nation that leads the Pilipilunas 2022 initiative in coordinating with our faculty and researchers from different units of the university to reflect on the state of our nation and present a multidisciplinary approach to problem solving. From the series of roundtable discussions, we'll draw up a governance agenda that we hope will contribute to the national conversation leading up to and beyond the 2022 elections. We want to impress on our policymakers and the public our university's readiness to help our country rebuild our political, economic, socio-cultural institutions on more sustainable and equitable foundations. So the Pilipilunas 2022 series was launched last August 2021 with a discussion that set a tone and frame for the series by asking the basic question, ano nga ba ang magandang buhay at bukas para sa mga Pilipino? This was followed by 6 webinars on the public transportation sector, 2nd, electoral and political reforms, 3, local governance. This webinar reviewed the 30-year-old local government code. 4, strategic Philippine foreign relations. 5, a webinar on higher education in the next normal. And just last month, a webinar on economic recovery and transformation. For today's webinar entitled Pamumuhay Nang May Dignidad para sa Lahat, we focus on the problem of poverty and inequality in the Philippines and government's delivery of social services and social protection. Our panelists will discuss the role of universal social protection as a measure to combat poverty and inequality. In particular, we look at the issues and challenges faced by the proposed National Social Protection Floor. I would like to thank the convener of today's webinar, Dr. Raquiza of UP NCPAG, a member of the Task Force Nation Building, and our moderator, Veronica Jimenez. Thank you to other partners in this project, DZUP 1602 and the UP Diliman Information Office. I'd like to thank our panelists, Dr. Raquiza, Professor Rene Ofreneo, DBM USEC, Rolando Toledo, ASEC Alex Avila of the Department of Labor and Employment, Professor Del Flores of NCPAG, Congressman Alfred Vargas, and Mr. Marcos Roque of the International Labor Organization. And of course, the UP Diliman Task Force Nation Building and its chair, Dr. Tonette Raquiza, for organizing this webinar series. And thank you to Dr. Ton Clemente, another member of the task force, who will give the wrap-up and closing remarks today. And to all of you, thank you for joining us in this webinar. Maraming salamat. Magandang umaga sa ating lahat.
Thank you, Chancellor Nemenzo. Before we call on our first speaker, we would like to remind everyone to please post your questions on the Q&A Google form, which will be posted on our chat box. Don't forget, because your questions will be asked during the open forum. You may access the Google form in our chat box. I'm not sure if they already, I think they're going to be posting it right now. And we encourage the use of the hashtag Pilipilunas 2022 in posts about the event. Our first speaker is the Associate Professor of the UP National College of Public Administration and Governance, or NCPAG. She's co-convener of Social Watch Philippines and a commissioner of the Commission on Population and Development. She's also a board member of the Social Weather Station and sits in other advisory bodies of a number of public and private development institutions. Please welcome Dr. Maria Victoria R. Raquiza.
Good morning to everyone. I am extremely happy to be here this morning, and I'm particularly honored to be in a panel with some of the leading champions of the social protection floor, both here and abroad. As you know, the National Social Protection Floor, derived from the Universal Social Protection Floor, is an aspiration that has been that has animated and inspired many, as it is seen to help promote a life of dignity, because it flows from a rights-based approach to development, and it is really seen as an important imperative. The National Social Protection Floor is the country's operationalization of the Universal Social Protection Floor, Um, you know, as I was saying, many have been inspired by its concept, and many have moved on to try to make this more real. For example, one of the NGOs that I'm a part of, which is Social Watch, is the secretariat of the Global Coalition of CSOs that are promoting the universal social protection floor. And in the Philippines, there is an interagency body led by the Department of Labor and Development that has been championing the National Social Protection Floor, of which I am a member of that expanded body. And we are extremely fortunate to have with us this morning Dole ASEC Alex Avila, who will present the proposed National Social Protection Floor program. He will talk about its relevance, its significance, and how do we make it happen for our country in spite the constraints that we are confronted with. I think that he will also end with a note of hope that this isn't an impossible dream if the political will and if the vision is there. On my part, what I will do is to help locate the NSPF in the country's development context, discuss some of its normative and legal basis, identify some issues and challenges that confront social protection programs, and explain why, in that context, napaka-appealing then is the National Social Protection Floor. But I will also point to some of the constraints that we need to grapple with if we want to implement this. There are very real also fiscal constraints, administrative constraints, and a couple of others. And then I would like to wrap up by just pointing out a couple of factors that we need to take into account moving forward. So let me start with the poverty situation in the country. So based on the latest PSA 2021 report, the country's poverty incidence, which was already high at 16% in 2018, further increased to 18% by 2021. In real terms, the number of poor Filipinos, according to official poverty statistics, increased from 22,260,000 to 26,140,000, or an additional 3.8 million, almost 4 million if you look at the data. And to some extent, this could be underreported for various issues, including methodological issues that can be talked about in another forum if you like. Currently, international conflict, like what's going on now in Europe, has also made life harder because of inflation on oil and transportation, which has driven increases in housing, water, electricity, and which, of course, will have an impact on the situation of our people who are already reeling from the impact of the pandemic. So that the hardship to some extent has been exacerbated. I would just also like to note that while we have our official poverty statistics, there are also other participatory approaches to measuring poverty, which is what, for example, organizations like the Social Weather Station does, where they have self-rated poverty surveys, where it shows that the poor have their own ideas about what their poverty levels are. What for them is a poverty threshold, how much they need to be considered poor. And they also have their own narrative about when they move in and out of poverty or when they're feeling stuck. Now, in terms of the Gini coefficient, as the Gini coefficient is a measure of income equality, where 0 indicates perfect income equality among families, and 1 indicates absolute equality. Here is the table of our Gini coefficient from 1965 up to 2018. The Gini coefficient for 2021 has yet to be released by our friends from PSA. Given the pandemic, it is almost likely, very likely, that inequality has gone up. Now focus your attention on the Gini coefficient from 1985 to 2015, or even 2018. No? What do we see? What do we note? What we see is, as former NSO Administrator Butch Africa has observed, the stagnation. What we see is a stagnation of our country's Gini coefficient. In other words, it has generally stayed the same for the last 3 decades. Do note that a 0.4 Gini is generally considered high by international standards. Now, during the pandemic, we saw that almost 4 million Filipinos were further impoverished, while the top richest Filipino billionaires actually increased their wealth by 30% during the same period of time. So this situation underscores worsening inequality in the country. But if we look at our constitution, our laws, and the treaties that we have signed, the situation that we're confronted with was rather different from the ambitions and aspirations of the framers of our constitution. In fact, a Philippine constitution is viewed as among the most progressive, given its developmental aspiration and ambition. As you can read, it really puts a premium on valuing human dignity, full respect for human rights. In fact, there's a long article, 19 sections devoted to social justice and human rights, as in Article 8. When reading all of these articles together, it is clear that the Philippine Constitution views poverty as an issue of social justice, human dignity, and human rights. In fact, the Constitution refers to having adequate access to social services, full employment, and for our people to live within a certain standard of living, so central to the notion of the social protection floor, including an improved quality of life, which lays the preconditions for a life of dignity. The vision is to be applied for all, which lays the basis for universalism. Finally, as underscored in Article 8, it also recognizes the need to focus on the structural causes of poverty and push for structural reforms, which lays again the constitutional mandate for measures to be more transformative, both at the economic and social sphere. Of course, we have since then enacted several laws, signed numerous international agreements, including on human rights and on various ILO conventions. No? And here we give special mention to the ILO Social Protection Floor Recommendation 2012, which guides governments in building comprehensive social security systems and extending social security coverage by establishing the National Social Protection Floor. And this proposition is echoed in the 2030 Global Development Agenda on the SDGs, which calls for governments to implement these social protection systems at the national level, including floors. No? And this is found in Goal 1, which makes a call to end poverty in all its forms. So we're no longer looking at simply poverty alleviation, poverty reduction, and in fact, poverty eradication. As we know, our country has numerous social protection programs in terms of providing social safety nets, assistance programs like CCT, social security programs like the ones provided by SSS, PhilHealth, and the like, as well as several labor market interventions like the provision of reskilling activities and job fairs provided by numerous agencies. In fact, the Philippine government was among the more active responders to COVID-19 in providing social protection measures based on the ILO Monitor of Government Responses during the COVID-19 in the first half of 2020. SWS found that 72% of Filipino families benefited from the cash assistance from DSWD as well as LGUs. However, having said this, many of us are aware of the social protection measures that have faced serious challenges. And here I will point to some of the issues that confront the implementation of social protection measures. Of course, we know ILO and many other institutions have talked about how social service and protection provisioning provided by various agencies have a tendency to be fragmented. We also know that Social Security membership, especially for the informal sector, is very limited. There is still a challenge for our Social Security institutions to really reach many of our workers found in the informal sector, and we know that's a sizable lot. Limited access to social assistance programs. The exclusion rate, for example, of CCT is rather high. At one point, it was over 40%. There are administrative efficiency issues. So I remember that when the pandemic struck, and DSWD worked very hard to provide the SAPs and all that. But at some point, even their people were infected by COVID. So at some point, they had to stop operations. No? So how do we shock-proof our system so that delivery continues? Of course, there are also issues around these measures being used as forms of clientelism and patronage politics. So here we see, for example, how the ayuda or the SAPs were sometimes used by local officials as something to promote their political interests. So there were about 400 barangay captains, I think, who were charged with graft. And then the need for stronger enforcement of social security, because many companies are still not providing adequate social protection for their employees, and many other issues here, including the issue of the need to also while targeting is something that we do, we also believe that given the magnitude of poverty in the country and inequality, the beauty and the necessity to go beyond targeting and explore more universal social protection approaches. So some of the issues that are associated with targeting and residual social policy, of course, would be particularly the exclusion errors. And I mentioned to some extent there was a high exclusion rate for CCT. That is also true when the ayuda started. We can talk a bit about that later in the open forum. It's vulnerability to patronage politics and clientelism. There is also an issue of stigmatizing when the poor are othered. They are othered because they have and therefore receive this largesse from the government. There is a kind of stigma sometimes that is involved. A tendency to foster segmentation. Bakit sila nakakakuha, kami hindi at the local community? So divisions occur. And if our administrative and governance systems are not truly, not yet as efficient and effective as it would want it to be, it can stretch and burden our systems. So thankfully, this notion around universal and more transformative type of social protection is already high, I think. It started to really come to the fore in the mindsets of our policymakers. And I'm happy to report that in the 2017 to 2022 Philippine Development Plan, on the chapter on social protection, working with our colleagues at the DSWD, we were able to bring in the language of universal and transformative social protection in the plan. And this was further operationalized, discussed in the Philippine Operational Framework and Strategy paper that was produced by an interagency body and led by DSWD, and where many of our colleagues and CSOs, academia, and other stakeholders really collaborated through a series of consultations so that, the notions, the discourse around universalism and transformative social protection came to the fore. Here, when we talk about universal, it refers to a minimum level of income or consumption granted to all citizens. So at the same time, we acknowledge in the document that, of course, many governments have limited capacities and resources. So the notion of progressive realization was introduced, particularly through the social protection floor. So when we talk about, again, universal, this means that the benefits are no longer conditioned on means testing, or there is a conditionality attached, and it will provide really coverage across different income groups. So this can be considered as universal. I would just like to add, and I always say this in my class on social policy, that within a universalist frame, targeting is oftentimes still necessary, specifically when you need to reach out to hard-to-reach vulnerable groups or individuals to make sure that they too benefit from universal programs. So here we see how universalism and targeting are actually complementary. We can do targeting within a universalist frame. And then the notion of transformative entered this document, because it refers to the structural causes of poverty. We're not simply looking at symptoms, causes of poverty, social exclusion, and discrimination, with a view to addressing unequal social and power relations. Finally, there's again the explicit mention of the progressive realization of the universal coverage of social protection through the floor. And this is in the strategy paper. So it is really in this context, no, where the National Social Protection Floor is so appealing, and ASEC Avila will provide really the richness, no, to the aspiration and the relevance of the NSPF. But let me just mention why it's so appealing. One is because its rights-based entitlement approach is undeniable, as it employs a variation of the universalism approach, that of group universalism, where benefits cover specific groups within the population. For example, children or older persons. And then there is progressive realization and expansion so that we're able to reach more. Second, it begins to address much of the concerns related to targeting. There will be less exclusion errors. There will be less stigmatizing and clientelism, because we're giving more swathes of the population access to these benefits, less segmentation and division. And because the implementation of the floor starts with an assessment of the various social protection programs implemented across agencies, this is called the assessment-based national dialogue. This exercise helps to identify where are the areas of fragmentation, where are the areas of duplication, where are the gaps, including financing gaps, with a view to overcoming these challenges. And finally,
Dr. Raquiza, yeah, sorry, you have to wrap up.
Okay. And finally, thank you. I know I get so excited, so sorry. So anyway, and finally, it builds on the existing initiatives that are already there. We have Pantawid Pamilya, we have the social pension for indigent senior citizens. So we work with what is existing with a view to rationalizing and expanding these programs. Of course, there are fiscal constraints that we are confronted with, but studies show that an important factor for creating fiscal space for social spending is really a country's policy framework, which reflect the values and priorities of policymakers. In other words, policy mindset is critical. For example, fiscally conservative policymakers tend to overemphasize cost effectiveness. But on the other hand, more developmentally minded policymakers don't see spending for education and health, for example, as cost. They see it as social investments, which create multiple positive development impacts and are more willing, therefore, to spend on these social services. We also see that fiscal space is possible, even in low-income countries. For example, prior to the pandemic, in countries with lower levels of GDP, they already had universal pension programs, like in Bolivia, Lesotho, and Namibia. Of course, that does not to say its fiscal space is not real. It is real. It remains a concern. But we can build our institutional capacities to develop our fiscal capacity across time, for as long as the vision is clear and there is political will. My last two slides. Other factors to consider is that we must also, I think we remember that cash transfers, embedded, for example, in notions like the floor, are important, but they are not substitutes for increasing public investment for social services. So policy attention should not be taken away from social services, because public investments are still so critical. For example, many of our CCT beneficiary children who had access to increased incomes because of CCT did not necessarily perform better than non-CCT beneficiaries in terms of education and health, particularly in the early days, of the first few years of CCT implementation, because many of the schools were still suffering from lack of textbooks, lack of infrastructure, lack of teachers, and same in the health centers. So we still need to look at that. And finally, In developing country context, it is often the non-state actors such as families, NGOs, religious organizations that assume a prominent role on social provisioning. But despite the important role of non-state actors, they are not and they cannot be a substitute for the state. This underscores not only the need to strengthen state capacity, but also the rights-based approach where the state is a duty bearer and the citizens are claim holders. In this context, support for citizens to avail of quality social services are seen not as acts of kindness of certain politicians, clientelism, or acts of charity, but are really seen as a right and an entitlement of our citizens. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raquiza, for that very informative talk. Now, a few reminders. Please post your questions on the Q&A Google form that is posted in our Zoom chat box. Your questions will be read during the open forum. We encourage the use of hashtag Pilipilunas2022 in your posts about the event. Our next speaker is the Undersecretary of the Budget Policy and Strategy Group of the Philippine Department of Budget and Management, or DBM. He currently chairs the Executive Technical Board of the Development Budget Coordination Committee that reviews and approves the macroeconomic targets, revenue projections, borrowing level, aggregate budget level, and expenditure priorities of the country. As the lead secretariat for the Philippine Open Government Partnership and the Participatory Governance Cluster, he supervises the department's initiatives that promote fiscal transparency and participatory governance. Please welcome Undersecretary Rolando U. Toledo.
Thank you very much, Ms. Veronica. So good morning to all. First, I would like to thank the University of the Philippines, especially the UP and CPAG, for inviting the DBM to partake in this webinar. So this is indeed a great opportunity for us to shed light on the various programs and initiatives of the government that seeks to improve the welfare of the vulnerable sector, particularly through our various social programs. Please also allow me to acknowledge, of course, the presence of my fellow speakers and discussant, of course, Congressman Alfredo Vargas, Assistant Secretary Alex Avila, Mr. Marcus Rook, Professor Dr. Rene Ofreneo, Professor, of course, Dr. Victoria Raquiza, and Director Herisalde Flores. Okay. So really, this presentation seeks to provide an overview of the government's policy support for the social sector. Okay, just to briefly give context, as I think this was already presented earlier, also by Dr. Raquiza. Here we can see that the poverty and subsistence incidents among the Philippine population for 2018 and the first semester of 2021, it can be observed that the incidence rates increased from 2018 to 2021, notably as an effect of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, recognizing the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on various sectors in the country, including the social sector, so the DBM has released 716.95 billion worth of funds as of December 31, 2021 to different agencies to support its recovery measures. Now, of this amount, we see that 246.78 billion, or roughly 34% of the total COVID-19 release went to social amelioration purposes. So really, this covers support for the social amelioration program intended to provide subsidy to poor and vulnerable households, as well as to the various social protection services of the DSWD, such as the assistance to individuals in crisis situation or IX program. Now, as of December 31, 2021, the obligation and disbursement rates of these allocations were above 90% implying good performance by the implementing agencies. Now, in terms of budget support, under the general appropriations, it is also evident that the social sector has always been one of the government's priority expenditures. Now, this slide provides us the expenditure program based on the classification of the functions of government, or we call it the COFOG system from fiscal year 2016 to 2022. And you can find this in our yearly submission under the budget and expenditure sources of financing, so BESF namin. So the COFOG system is a consolidation of government allocation for expenditure coming from different departments and agencies. So we note that the social sector was allocated with at least 401 billion since 2016, and the fiscal year 22 level posited 509.2 billion. So this pertains to all PAPs, or programs, activities, and projects that contribute to the said sector, and not necessarily only those PAPs from the DSWD. This normally covers programs intended for 4P beneficiaries, senior citizens, and the unemployed, among others. Now, starting with the DSWG, just to give you a little breakdown, which has consistently been one of the top 10 budget recipients, we have allocated around 205 billion to support its operations and programs for fiscal year 2022. So among these initiatives are the Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program, which was kanina mentioned by Dr. Raquiza, or the conditional cash transfers, which intends to support the poverty reduction and social development strategy of the national government. So as many of us here are all already familiar with the 4Ps, this provides cash grants and training programs to eligible beneficiaries identified by the DSWD. Another one is the unconditional cash transfer program. Meanwhile, was implemented as a social mitigating measures designed to protect the poor and vulnerable from the effects of the train law. So it has provided cash grants to the poorest 10 million households and has been implemented by the Land Bank of the Philippines from 2019 to 2020. Now, the DSWD also handles the social pension for indigent senior citizens through monthly stipend. This is also has been consistently budgeted with around 25 billion allocated for this year. Now, it is also noteworthy to highlight the budgetary support provided to the DOLE, which as we can see in the table, has significantly increased since 2020 as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, for fiscal year 2022, the DOLE will be receiving 51.3 billion, or an increase of 38% from its budget last year. Now, one of the livelihood program of the DOLE is the Tulong Panghanap Buhay sa ating disadvantaged or displaced workers, or TUPAD program, and government internship program, which has been allocated with 26.5 billion this year. Now, moving forward, all levels of government are committed to work hand in hand to extend continuous support to the social services sector natin. So as the implementation of the Supreme Court ruling on the Mandanas-Garcia case is set this year, we are expecting stronger collaboration between the national government and local government units in the delivery of public goods and services to the people. Agencies and departments in particular will play a key role in the provision of technical assistance and, of course, monitoring assessment of the LGUs. While the actors at the local government are endowed with bigger shares from the national taxes to support the implementation of the devolved functions, pursuant to Local Government Code of 1991. Okay. Now, a whole of government approach is likewise needed to address the challenges faced by our social sector. So as also mentioned by Dr. Raquiza, our updated PDP 2017 to 2022 has been able to identify some of the key strategic policy action as seen in this slide to ensure food resiliency and to reduce vulnerabilities of Filipinos. So the proposed initiatives under Chapter 11 of the updated PDP seeks to guarantee the country's social protection system in response is responsive in keeping the country healthy and resilient as it adjusts to the changes brought about by the emergencies. So in fact, one of the strategies highlighted therein is the proposal to institutionalize the social protection floor given its instrumentality in securing access of people of social protection services. So this initiative is currently being addressed and discussed at the policy level. Okay, now to conclude my presentation, I would like to end by signifying our continued support for strengthening the country's social protection system. This is vital now more than ever as we are still recovering from the socioeconomics of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as from, of course, the current global issues such as the increase in oil prices. So pouring in support to fund, capacitate, and digitize our social services sector is therefore a policy measure that the whole of government is committed to continue over the long term. So thank you very much and good morning once again.
Thank you so much, Yusek Toledo, for your engaging presentation. Once again, we would like to remind our participants to please post questions on the Q&A Google form sent through our Zoom chat. The questions will be read during the open forum. Also, please use hashtag Pilipilunas2022 in your posts about the event. Also, attendees who are able to fill up the evaluation form will be receiving an e-certificate. The form will be sent after the open forum. At this point, we would like to present to you a video by DZUP on the topic National Social Protection Floor entitled Pulso ng Masa. Let's watch this.
Ano ang naging epekto ng pandemya sa iyong pamumuhay?
Naging mas mahirap maghanap ng trabaho. Tapos most ng work na naghahanap contractual lang kasi pandemic, so uncertain.
Marami. Hindi ako makapagtrabaho. Hindi ako makapunta sa dapat puntahan. Siyempre nakakabahala yung mga nangyayari araw-araw.
Mas lumala yung mental health condition ko sa dami ng problemang iniisip araw-araw. Tulad ng paano yung pang-araw-araw na pagkain namin, sapat na ba yung perang panggasto sa mga pangangailangan?
Sapat ba ang iyong kinikita sa pang-araw-araw na gastusin?
Hindi sapat kasi kulang. Kailangan pang humingi ng ayuda mula sa gobyerno.
Hindi. Kailangan isipin mo rin yung face mask, alcohol, disinfectant sa budget. Maliban pa sa pagkain. Plus, nagmahal sa pamasahe from 10 to 20 sa trike. Sa bus, jeep, increase din.
Hindi. Parang nagtitipid din ang kumpanya sa ibibigay sa sweldo sa amin.
Natutugunan ba ang iyong mga pangangailangan sa kalusugan?
Not totally. Hanggang vitamins lang, which hindi pa nga consistent. Pero for emergencies, wala talaga.
Hindi masyado. Hirap ng access sa mga gamot kapag ubusan tulad nung nagka-COVID kami.
Hindi. Kapag nagkasakit sa trabaho, hindi naman sasagutin ng kumpanya namin eh. Hirap din naman umasa sa gobyerno.
Ano ang mga serbisyo at programa na dapat pagtuunan ng mga susunod na lider para mas bumuti at umangat ang pamumuhay ng mga Pilipino?
Free healthcare talaga. Dapat din mas may pondo sa mga rural health unit para sa ibang gamot maliban sa usual first aid services. Sa katrabaho o suporta man lang sa mga nawalan ng trabaho ngayong pandemya.
Healthcare para sa lahat, regular man o kontraktual, at ayuda sa transportasyon para hindi paasa ng operators yung fare increase sa mga pasahero.
Pagtaas ng sweldo ng mga manggagawa, libreng edukasyon para sa kabataan, libreng serbisyong medikal para sa lahat, sapat na pinansyal na suporta para sa senior citizens, pagsasaayo sa pamamalakad ng lokal na pamahalaan.
Pamumuhay ng May Dignidad para sa lahat. A webinar on National Social Protection Floor. Bahagi ng #Pilipilunas 2022 Webinar Series ngayong March 14, alas 9:30 ng umaga.
Thank you for that video, DZUP. Our first discussant and main speaker for this event is presently an Assistant Secretary for Labor Relations, Social Protection and Policy Support Cluster of the Department of Labor and Employment. He chairs the Interagency Core Group under the Subcommittee on Social Protection composed of the DOLE, Institute for Labor Studies, Employees Compensation Commission, and NEDA, tasked to lead the formulation of the social protection floor for the Philippines. Please welcome Assistant Secretary Alex Avila.
Maraming salamat, Ms. Veronica. Good morning to all participants, organizers, and fellow discussants in this webinar on the National Social Protection Floor. On behalf of my colleagues in the core group tasked by the Social Development Committee, Subcommittee on Social Protection, to lead the formulation of the Social Protection Floor for the Philippines, I would like to thank UP Diliman for giving us this opportunity for information exchange on the establishment of the National SPF. My presentation consists of 4 parts. I will start with the overview and context of the SPF project, to be followed by a discussion of the SP Situationer and the initial recommendations based on the results of the assessment-based national dialogue process. I'll then proceed to a presentation of the challenges and opportunities toward the institutionalization of the SPF in the country, and conclude with a call to action put forward by the World Social Protection Report 2020-2022. Our SPF journey began in 2014. Next slide, please. When the HDPRC approved the SPF concept and the conduct of a BND towards the establishment of the national SPF. Within the SDC-SCSP, an institutional structure was created with the DOLE and NEDA tasked to lead the groundwork for the SPF project. We are thankful to ILO Manila for providing technical and funding support since day one. But what exactly does Social Protection Floor mean? The Social Protection Floor's recommendation 2012 number 202, adopted at the 101st session of the International Labor Conference in 2012, contemplates SPFs as nationally defined sets of basic social security guarantees which secure protection aimed at preventing or alleviating poverty, vulnerability, and social exclusion. These social security guarantees, defined at a national minimum level, should ensure, first, access to a set goods and services constituting essential healthcare, including maternity care, that meets the criteria of availability, accessibility, acceptability, and quality. Second, basic income security for children, providing access to nutrition, education, care, and any other necessary goods and services. Third, basic income security for persons in active age who are unable to earn sufficient income, in particular in cases of sickness, unemployment, maternity, and disability. And fourth, basic income security for older persons. The ADNB has served as the backbone of the SPF project. It seeks to answer a basic question. Is the SPF a reality for all members of society? We conducted the ADNB following the many steps as you can see on the screen. As follows. First, through multi-stakeholder engagements and social dialogue, we developed an assessment matrix to determine the social security situation in the country. The matrix identified policy gaps and implementation issues, and what should be done to complete the floor, meaning, what are the priority recommendations to establish the floor? Second, we use the rapid assessment protocol to estimate the cost of implementing the social protection programs. The RAP enabled us to have an initial idea of how much the floor would cost in the present and in the future, and if the government can afford it. Clearly, fiscal space will decide if the SPF recommendations are affordable and sustainable. The social protection operational framework recognizes that the fiscal space issue of establishing the floors by adopting a progressive realization approach, as mentioned earlier by Dr. Raquiza, to ensure universal coverage of the SPF. We are now on the third and last step, which involves the finalization of the assessment report for endorsement to and approval by the Social Development Committee. The enhanced SP framework has given us a new policy tool to continue developing the SPF. It is intended to be used by all stakeholders involved in social protection policies, programs, and projects. Uses a risk management approach as a key component in identifying the risks and vulnerabilities, supported by the principles of universality, inclusivity, and of having a transformative role. The framework also recognizes the important role of the LGUs, NGOs, and CSOs in the implementation of SP programs through convergence and community-driven approach, as well as the need to ensure fiscal stability. And in view of the COVID-19 pandemic, it is also important to consider national emergencies as cross-cutting risks, in addition to individual life cycle risks, economic risks, natural hazards, and human-induced risks, as well as governance and political risks. Now, you can see on the next screen the various activities undertaken since we began. Next slide, please. Since we began the SPF journey in 2014. Next slide. Last October 2021, we presented the initial recommendations to the SDC Technical Board. We will go back to the board for the second time to present the revised recommendations for consideration of the Social Development Committee. Let me now give you the policy imperatives for the National SPF and the recommendations the ADNB process has produced. The institutionalization of the SPF is a national development strategy to achieve universal social protection. The updated PDP 2017-2022 prescribes the institutionalization of the SPF considered as vital in the improvement of social protection service delivery in the country, side by side with the development of a social protection code. The SPF is also a priority strategy in the Social Protection Plan 2020-2022. Is identified in the We Recover as One report as a mechanism to institutionalize social protection programs, and is one of the key elements of the enhanced social protection framework. Next slide. Social protection is also a key component of the 2030 agenda. as Goal 1.3 aims for social protection systems and measures for all, including floors. Social protection is relevant to at least 8 SDG goals, including goals 3 and 8 concerning good health and well-being, and decent work and economic growth, respectively. At this juncture, let me now briefly walk you through the rationale for the national SPF on the next slide. In the interest of time, I'll skip a detailed discussion of the situationnaire for each guarantee, which shows the actual and potential universe of the guarantees based on latest available data. The situationnaires not only give us an initial idea of the coverage and adequacy of our existing social protection programs, but also the gaps that must be closed to realize the national SPF. I ask for your indulgence for not including in this presentation the costs that implementing the recommendations will entail. This is still a work in progress, which at this moment I am not prepared to discuss. Filipino children need basic income security because of their inherent survival risks and the need to ensure their welfare and development. Latest available data show that 9.3 million children and 4.5 million youth out of around 40.44 million Filipino children are poor, of which 6.95 million are beneficiaries of the 4Ps program. At present, there is a range of policies and programs available to be progressively expanded in order to achieve income security and social protection for children by ensuring their access to nutrition, education, and care. On the other hand, the pandemic has exposed the vulnerability of persons in active age to economic shocks. As tens of thousands of local and migrant workers lost their jobs and sources of income, our social insurance and safety net mechanisms seem inadequate to respond to massive job displacement and income loss. The high unemployment and underemployment rates, as you can see on the screen, coupled with a large concentration of workers not only in the informal economy, but also in platform-based sector, brings to fore the need for basic income security guarantees. Older persons need basic income security because they are very vulnerable to escalating health risks. It is also a great challenge for senior citizens to earn a living. Hence, the need to provide better support for older persons with respect to their medical and other health-related needs. We can see on the screen the potential universe and estimated coverage of social pension among our senior citizens. Coverage and adequacy of benefits remains a serious gap, as around 43% of the older population do not have access to any pension scheme. The last guarantee is access to essential healthcare. Now more than ever, we need universal healthcare because of our increasing vulnerability to sickness and diseases and exposure to health hazards due to calamities, disasters, and pandemics. In 2019, out-of-pocket spending in the country was at 48%, the third highest in the Asian region, topped only by Myanmar with 76% and Cambodia with 64%. On a per capita basis, health spending was at 6,662 in 2019. Meanwhile, as of May 2020, PhilHealth membership stood at 94.8 million, which translates to almost 87% coverage of the 109 million population. Next slide. While it seems clear that there are funding sources for the full implementation of universal healthcare in the country, its financial requirements will certainly increase as the demands for effective and responsive healthcare continues to grow. Let us now take a quick look address the SPF recommendations we presented to the SDC Technical Board last year. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So these are the recommendations we have proposed to constitute the national SPF. You will notice that most of these programs and policies are already existing and benefiting certain segments of our population. The SPF is supposed to close the gaps and address the implementation issues of existing social protection policies and programs. And this usually seeks to address the issue of coverage and adequacy of benefits, as in the case of the social pension and the 4Ps, among other programs. Another approach here is to enhance accessibility by improving program implementation and service delivery. There are also new proposals to form part of the SPF, like subsidy for workers in the informal economy and guaranteed employment program to ensure income security in times of job loss. Without going into the details of the recommendations, it is clear that the SPF institutionalization requires addressing the issue of coverage, comprehensiveness, adequacy, and sustainability. We can go to the next slide. Let me point out that following the principle of progressive realization, which recommendation number 202 and the SP framework advocate, we segmented the implementation period of the recommendations into short and medium term and takes into consideration the prevailing situation, whether emergency or non-emergency situation. The idea is to ensure automatic activation of necessary programs during emergency situations like COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. Clearly, the key messages of the World Social Protection Report 2020-2022 resonate well to our situation, as presented a while ago, as we try to build an effective and resilient wall to protect our citizens through social protection. Now, the question is, where do we go from here? What are the challenges for the national SPF institutionalization? What are the possible solutions? The main challenge is the huge price tag of the SPF, which cannot possibly be met amid fiscal austerity. Ultimately, the fate of the national SPF lies squarely on fiscal space. It is for this reason that both the SP framework and recommendation 202 recognize the importance of incremental steps to realize the floors in a progressive manner. Another challenge is inequitable access to SP programs and services. This may be due to program design and institutional mechanisms, geographical and logistical constraints, and lack of awareness among target population groups. If a worker who suffered from work-related accidents doesn't know about employees' compensation program, she or he has no choice but to pay the cost of her or his medication and rehabilitation herself. Thus, it is important to raise people's awareness about social protection programs and services through a comprehensive and inclusive communication plan. Programs must be designed in a way that allows people with limited capacity to qualify and easily access the programs. The third challenge relates to the fact that various government agencies have their own social protection programs that tend to overlap, thereby resulting in inefficiencies. In this situation, convergence is usually the prescription, including the development and deployment of an integrated database system to improve targeting and availment, ensure better coordination, and enhance monitoring and evaluation. Within the context of further devolution of certain executive functions to LGUs, pursuant to the Mandanas-Garcia ruling, LGUs, I think, represent an ideal convergence point of national social protection programs and services. The national government just needs to provide the tools and the capacity so our LGUs can deliver social protection programs in a more efficient and effective manner. The SP framework recognizes the importance of participatory approach in the delivery of social protection at the local level. Social protection agencies should continue to work with LGUs, NGOs, CSOs, and the private sector to improve program implementation and service delivery through the adoption of innovative social insurance products which are affordable, scalable, and applicable to those outside the formal labor market. And lastly, it is fair to say that our legislators also recognize the need for a more responsive and effective social protection system in the country. This is a good news. In fact, there are bills pending in Congress which aim to, among other objectives, institute a national unemployment insurance program, financial assistance and social pension, expand the coverage of the unemployment benefit of the SSS, create a pension fund and social security and retirement system for OFWs, establish social protection programs for indigent farmers and fisherfolk without existing pension, provide government subsidy for the payment of the SSS premiums of PWDs, and extend the national feeding program to undernourished children in secondary schools. We expect these bills to be refiled in the next Congress. I also understand that NEDA and the SCSP have already started the groundwork toward the establishment of the social protection tool. My last slide, ladies and gentlemen, will try to conclude my presentation by quoting a call to action portion of the World Social Protection Report 2020-2022 as follows, and I quote, "Now is the time to take decisive action to shape the future of social protection. It remains to be seen whether the lessons learned from this crisis and previous ones will provide the necessary jolt for universal protection to be realized. To achieve this would require gaps in coverage, comprehensiveness, and adequacy to be closed, and national social protection systems to be reinforced, not least with solid protection, social protection floors that guarantee at least a basic level of social security to everyone throughout their lives. Universal social protection is a cornerstone of human-centered vision for the future, offering the prospect of realizing the human right to social security for all, eradicating and preventing poverty, reducing multiple and intersecting inequalities, enhancing human capabilities and productivity, fostering solidarity and fairness, and reinvigorating the social contract. Reinforcing social protection systems will be of paramount importance for the better future." Unquote. Indeed, the institutionalization of the national SPF is a big concrete step to ensure na sa Pilipinas ay mayroong pamumuhay ng may dignidad para sa lahat. Maraming salamat po sa inyong pakikinig.
Thank you so much, Asek Avila, for that comprehensive presentation. Our next discussant is a Professor Emeritus of the University of the Philippines and former Dean of the UP School of Labor and Industrial Relations. He is one of the leading scholars on labor relations and labor market studies in the Philippines and in the Asia Pacific. He is the president of 3 civil society organizations, the Freedom from Debt Coalition, Integrated Rural Development Foundation, and the Philippine Movement for Climate Justice. Please welcome Dr. Rene E. Ofreneo.
Okay, good morning everyone. Saludo po ako sa Task Force Pilipilunas, sa panguna ni ating mabuting Chancellor Nemenso, Professor Raquiza, at Saludo din po ako sa mga nauna nagsalita kay Professor Maribig, Yusek Toledo, itong kaibigan Alex Abila. Napaka-komprehensibo po ng kanilang pagtalakay. Now, ang akin pong alma mater, School of Labor and Industrial Relations, has been studying itong social protection and social security on and off since the 1970s and 80s. And so what I'll be discussing is give a brief historical overview kung paano nabuo itong social protection floor, and then what is the way forward using the lenses ng industrial relations, in particular, yung pagtingin po ng labor at civil society growth. May I share the screen? Mabilis lang po ito. Sabi yun. Okay, can you see this? Hello?
No, sir.
Hindi ba?
Hindi pa nakikita.
Kanina lumabas na po ah. Ulitin ko kaya. Ulit. Sorry ah. We tested it kanina. Share the screen. Okay. And then, nasa ba si... Wala pa rin ho?
Wala pa po.
But we tested it kanina. Mabuti ate for na. Pag hindi ho, babasahin ko na lang. Ulitin ko lang ulit. Okay. Share the screen. Wala. Where are you? Kanina po eh. Wala pa rin ho.
Wala.
Siguro basahin ko na lang ho kung in the interest of time. Okay. Una ho sa lahat, ang issue sa atin is paano ang survival ng masang Pilipino. Katatapos lamang po na parang nagpapaalam si COVID, pero ngayon naman dumating si stagflation. Stagnation, inflation, deepening unemployment. We last saw this noong pong 1980s, 1970s. This is very much unlike the crisis of 1997-98 na merong tsaka nitong 2008-2010 global financial crisis. May stagnation pero hindi masyado yung inflation. But this time, all of this happening. So how can we have a good program of social protection to save the nation? Right now, we went through a very two horrible years, 2020 and 2021. We call them Annos Horribilis. Ang Pilipinas po is the third most afflicted COVID country in Asia after India and Indonesia. Ang ating economy badly shaken, 9.5% of the GDP, shrinking. And then nagpatuloy po ang stagnation ito in 2021. Many businesses, jobs, livelihood collapse. And then largely due to running lockdowns, weak government stimulus, and poor management of pandemic. At ang complaint po ng mga maralita, kahig ng kahig, wala namang matuka. At ngayon po nagpapatuloy yata yung ganitong sistema. And the most affected, katulad ng binanggit na po kanina ng ilan, the informals, the precariat workers, the seniors, the children, and of course, nabanggit po yung social enumeration, but under Bayanihan 1 and 2, marami hong studies dito sa UP at ng civil society na masyadong limited. At yung Bayanihan 3 ay bakit hindi na-post. Now, short historical overview po ng social protection. Ang social protection po ay noong 1990s, 1980s, these are decades of neoliberalism in many parts of the world, especially in the Philippines. And itong dekada na ito, ang social protection was largely ignored. At ang dominant thinking po noon, to grow the economy and to make create jobs for all, deregulate, liberalize, privatize everything. At yun po ang common policy answer. So, at yung mga walang social security enrollment, bahala kayo sa buhay nyo. Pero at the turn of the millennium, ang World Bank, ADB, at ang Pilipinas po, nagsimulang yakapin ang social protection. Bakit po nagkaganon? Una po, tumindi ang criticism ng mga civil society at saka trade unions dito sa Washington Consensus. At ang isang prueba po yan, noong 1999 sa Seattle, bumagsak yung Ministerial Conference ng WTO. At yan nga, the lack of social protection for the many, yan ang isang issue. Ikalwa, dito naman sa Thailand, itong si Thaksin, na very populist, in response to the Asian crisis, nag-initiate siya itong universal health coverage. At yan po ang naging modelo ng maraming bansa dito sa Asia. At ikalo po, ang ILO na represented dito sa ating forum never stopped pushing for social protection. Kung titignan po niyo studies ng ILO nung magbuhat 1970s to the present, napakarami po at pakapal ng report nila. Now, smarting from this criticism, ang World Bank and AD po nagsimula mag-formulate ng kanilang social protection schemes. Nag-experiment sila sa Latin America ng Bolsa de Familia na later on tinawag natin conditional cash transfer at later on niyakap ng ADB at binigyan tayo ng CCT loans kasama at sinundat ang Philippines ng Indonesia at bigla na lang ang leader ng social protection ay World Bank at ADB. Now, ito po hindi sapat sa mga trade unions, civil society. Nagpatuloy po ang campaign nila 1980s, 1990s, 2000s at in particular po lagi nilang binabanggit yung mga UN ILO conventions, nabanggit na po kanina, pero ang demand po nila nagkakaisa. Healthcare for all, social security for all, basic services for all, education and skills for all, social care for all, and dagdag, jobs for all, bosses for all, justice for all, clean environment for all. Noong po 2012, as mentioned, na nagkaroon po ng victory po sa trade union movement at saka sa civil society movement, yung ILO recommendation 202. Kasi makita nyo, ang habang panahon ng pinagdaanan bago ito nakapasa at na-adapt. At in particular, yung konsepto na napakahalaga, National Social Protection Floor. At nariyan po yung mga guiding principles, universality, adequacy, mention na po ito ni kasamang Alex, social inclusion, respect for the rights, solidarity. But I would like to emphasize those 8 o 9 na guiding principles, yung pinakahuli, napakahalaga ho yung coherence with social, economic, and employment policies. At yun po ang malaking problema natin. Ang malaking problema ay yung implementation nitong social protection floor as envisioned dito sa ILO recommendation, it lost in transition ng panahon ng COVID, before COVID and during COVID, at even hanggang ngayon. Nabanggit na kanina yung ilang items. May marami na ho itong mga pag-aaral. I'm just synthesizing the result of fragmented social protection programs. Hindi po tayo kulang sa program. In fact, marami pero fragmented. Nakapasa yung universal health law pero hindi fully implemented. At ang mga PhilHealth patients spending more and more on out-of-pocket expenses. Social security system, regressive. At yung mga malaki ang contribution, hindi naman proportional ang natatanggap nila. And then exclusionary, maraming pong hindi nalilista at maraming na-register before pero dahil sa series of contractual jobs, eventually nawawala, hindi nila alam kung miyembro pa sila. Informals limited, social security participation, alam po natin yan. Ang Department of Labor po, kaibigan namin sa pagpupus ng MACWI, Magna Carta for Workers in the Informal Economy. Ito para mabigyan ng boses at dagdag na ayuda ang mga informals. And yet, 2 dekada na pong languishing in Congress itong MACWI. At naintindihan natin, parang hindi ito priority ng elite na nakaupo sa Kongreso. Limited pension sa mga elderly na katulad ko. And nabanggit na po kanina ni Alex Avila, yung isang problema talaga yung mga children, yung phenomenon ng stunting because of limited social protection. At dito mag-COVID, nawala pa yung school feeding sa maraming paaralan. Now with COVID, more negative revelations. Yung target beneficiary po na 23 million, mukha yatang 14 million lang ang naabot at tapos isang beses lang. And then ang ating health sector, broken and in crisis. Bakit ito broken? Nakita natin, undeveloped ang health facilities, lalo na magsimula yung response ng government. At ang isang dahilan yung masyadong obsession in the past sa privatization and therefore commercialization ng health service. Kamunting na nga i-privatize pa yung ilang mga government hospitals dito sa Quezon City. Umalma lang ang ilang tao. High cost of medicine at napakalaki po ng import dependence sa mga multinational. Kaya napakamahal po ng gamot, lalo na mga antibiotic. Nabanggit ko na yung out-of-pocket expenses, pataas ng pataas. So yung coverage sa yung nagastos na dapat ng PhilHealth lumiliit. Total health expenditures is only around 3.5% ng ating GDP. Mababa raw ito compared sa Cambodia, India, Japan, and Mongolia na above 6%. May problema sa infant mortality. Hindi ko nababanggit itong mga statistics na ito. But last year and the other year, sa laming oras pong inubos ng ating Senado sa pag-imbestiga sa sitwasyon sa PhilHealth at later on, this is a procurement ng ating mga anti-COVID materials. And undeveloped po ang infrastructures for the universal healthcare. At ang sabi nila, abutin daw ng taon bago sabi pa mismo ito ng mga taga-DOS bago maitayo ang programa na universal. Now, bilanggit po yung issue kanina, social protection in crisis periods, fundable or unfundable. If you will remember, early last year, yung pong ilang congressmen, congresswomen, affiliated pa nga sa administration, nagpo-propose na magkaroon naman ng bayanihan 3 sapagkat maraming umaaray, lalo na dyan sa mga nawalan ng trabaho dito sa Metro Manila at mga negosyong maliliit, micro, small, medium enterprises. At siguro na alaala nyo ang sagot ng ating NEDA, sagot ng DOF, unfundable. Unfundable. Ito pong position na ito ng mga technocrats natin ay dapat pong i-contest o dapat man lang magkaroon ng talakayan. Ano bang argument nila? Ang sabi po ng ILO, ito yung marami namang study ang ILO, na ang isang bansa para ma-meet yung social protection program should spend at least a minimum of 6% of the GDP, equivalent GDP. Sa developed countries po, ang minimum is 24%. At may nakita nga ako na as high as 40% of the GDP. Kaya medyo kahit na nitong mag-COVID, umakyat pa sa 50% ang spending nila, yung social spending. So medyo may problema. Bakit hindi po natin magawa yon? Of course, ang issue ay saan kukuha ng pera ang ating gobyerno. Dahil mataas po ang level ng ating utang. Ang utang po natin nitong 2021 is 11.7 trillion. Halos doble po sa 5.9 trillion noong 2016 nang maupo ang ating Pangulo. So ang debt to GDP ratio natin na 39% noong 2019, umakyat na po sa 60%. Yun po yung threshold na kinatatakutan ng ilang mga nagbabantay sa death situation sapagkat ganyan po ang nangyari sa atin noong 1980s, 1990s, 2000. Ang laki ng ina-allocate ng ating DBM sa automatic debt service. And debt service po sa 2022 is projected to be 1.3 trillion. Ang budget is 5.1 trillion. Pwede ako i-correct ni Yusek Toledo, pero under the automatic debt service appropriation law, automatic daw ang allocation na yan. Dapat po mabago siguro yon. Pero ang mga trade union po, civil society, ay nag-a-advance ng ilang paraan para mabawasan ang yung tinatawag na fiscal distress at makapaglaan ng dagdag na pera o ayuda sa social protection. Ano po? Ang ilan po babanggitin ko, pero ito po ay preliminary list. Number 1, dapat po magkaroon tayo ng wealth o solidarity tax to cover at least yung 500 richest individual families. Meron pong study na yung 50 pinakamayamang pamilya sa Pilipinas, sila ang halos buong Pilipinas pag-aari nila. Masyadong unequal. And ikalwa, I call this solidarity tax sapagkat this is also solidarity for themselves. Kasi how can they accumulate wealth and continue business kung bumabagsak yung ekonomiya na pinanggagalingan ng kanilang yaman? So they have to get into action and help the nation. At in fact, sa panukala ko po, kung maupo ang bagong presidente, dahil meron siyang political will, i-combine niya sa Malacanang yung 500 pinakamayaman at ihamunin niya paano nyo tutulungan ang gobyerno para makover itong ating mga gastusin na ito. Ikalwa, make taxation system more progressive. Ito po'y matagal nang ipinupus ng mga progressive economists like Joseph Stiglitz na baligtad na nangyari sa atin. Nagkaroon tayo ng train na nakapokus more taxes sa masa, excise tax dyan sa oil. At ngayon po, nagkaroon tayo ng CREATE. It's a tax nagbibigay ng fiscal incentive sa mga malalaking korporasyon. Nasabi mismo ng gobyerno, sa loob ng 5 taon, 500 bilyon ang mawawala sa revenue. These are revenue eroding. At ang purpose nila, magkaroon daw ng foreign investment. You see, that is a very bad reading of the global situation. In fact, ang UNCTAD mismo nagsasabi, pabagsak ang flow ng foreign investment, and then you have this disruption ng global value chain. Ikatlo, kung meron man pumasok, bago makakreate ng jobs, it takes years bago magtayo po ng factory. Hindi po ganun kadali. So, ikatlo, i-purge po natin ang ating budget ng pork. We just held a webinar on the budget. At doon po sa pagsusuri ng isang researcher namin na dating taga DBM, sabi niya, 292 billion out of the 785 billion na nakalaan sa public works ay masasabing public pork sapagkat nakatuon sa mga para mga local specialized projects na usually sponsored ng mga congressmen na tumatakbo. Moreover, may mga unprogrammed items na nasa education, health, etc. 162 billion. Sabi niya, potential source pa rin yan ng pork. So,
Dr. Ofeneo, please wrap up.
Matatapos na nga ho eh. Tapos, i-tweak po yung ating BBB, build. I-prioritize natin ang mga infrastructures for urban and rural communities. And i-review po ang ating pagmamaneho ng utang. Negotiate for better terms, cancellation ng mga odious debt, etc. So, ang punto ko po, ang ILO Recommendation 202 of 2012, napakaganda po, National Social Protection Floor, pero mahalaga po magkaroon ng enabling social economic policies. Yung pong social economic inequality, marginalization ng mga pobreng magsasaka, degradation of worker standards, and so on. Iyon po yung nakaugat sa mga bad policies that eventually create so much vulnerabilities and insecurities to large segments of Philippine society na eventually dapat sagutin ng gobyerno, wala namang pondo. Ang isang very good example, naririnig nyo na yung rice tarification law at saka itong import liberalization program na nasa livestock, sa gulay, sa isda, na pumapatay sa ating agriculture. So let me conclude. Mahalaga po yung policy coherence. At yung example po ng issue ng policy coherence, ay nga po, nung pong 1978 sa Alma-Ata, nagsabi na ang World Health Organization, hindi pwede magkaroon ng health for all kung yung pong issue ng health ay hindi connected sa political, economic, socio-economic arrangement. At in particular, sabi nila, magkaroon dapat ng malakas, strong primary healthcare. At ito ay dapat nakabatay sa mga barangay. So therefore, to conclude, social protection po ay dapat magkaroon ng bagong pananaw. Dapat ito ay sabihin ng diretsuhan. Social protection is needed as an investment, as instrument for survival and recovery. Hindi po pwede na yung hindi lagi nilang sinasabi ang daan ay liberalize, privatize, deregulate. I-cast aside po natin yan. Ito pa may pagka-anti-poor, anti-social protection, and even anti-Filipino. At sana po, let this itong social protection as development instrument, tanggapin natin to have the weak and vulnerable and ensure nation survival recovery. Yan po sa economics, ang tawag yan, counter-cyclical. Let this be the topic of UP's next webinar. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ofreneo, for that enlightening talk. Our next discussant is a public servant. He is the representative of the 5th District of Quezon City, the chairperson of the Committee on Social Services, and the top 8 out of 300 representatives in legislative performance. A youth leader and mentor, he is one of the awardees of the 10 Outstanding Young Men of the Philippines in 2019 and the 2020 JCIP National Training Director. He is also an entrepreneur, a dedicated family man, and an award-winning film producer and artist. He could not be with us this morning, but he sent us his video message. Let's hear it from Representative Alfred Vargas.
We are all born free and equal in dignity and rights, endowed with reason and conscience, and part of the same human family. It is this dignity, this inherent human dignity, that we consciously strive to uphold and protect in our work as public servants. Sa mga kasama ko sa paglilinang at sa pagpapalaya ng kamalayan ng kapwa nating Pilipino, magandang umaga po. Mga kapwa kong scholar ng bayan, it is our mandate, our duty, and our responsibility as the people's servants to be caretakers of human dignity. And as a caretaker of human dignity, it is with a deep sense of duty that I speak today about an important good governance measure aimed at upholding and protecting the dignity of all Filipinos, the Universal Social Protection Floor. The International Labor Organization defines the social protection floor as the nationally defined sets of social security guarantees that should ensure as a minimum that over the life cycle, mula sinapupunan hanggang himlayan, all in need have access to essential health care and to basic income security. Basic income security in turn secures effective access to necessary goods and services. What Universal Social Protection Floor means for the Filipino is that all Filipinos should have access to affordable essential health care. It means that all Filipinos receive basic income security, which provides them access to nutrition, education, and care. The same is extended especially to all persons in active age who are not able to earn sufficient income, especially because of sickness, unemployment, maternity, or disability. Finally, it means that all Filipinos in old age should receive income security through pensions or transfers in kind. The Universal Social Protection Floor, in other words, is a measure for human dignity. It preserves the dignity of the Filipino in times of disease, that he or she should not beg just so he or she can get the next dose of life-saving medication, that he or she does not have to sell his or her vote so that a loved one can undergo dialysis, that he or she does not have to mortgage their family home or to go to the pawn shop to exchange a family heirloom for money or fall as victims to loan sharks and unscrupulous syndicates. The Universal Social Protection Floor makes sure that at the time when the Filipino is his or her lowest, he or she can still stand tall. This need to define and implement the Filipino Universal Social Protection Floor became more apparent during this pandemic. At its worst, the pandemic resulted to a 17.6% record of unemployment rate last year, economically displacing millions of Filipino workers and affecting families all across Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. Imagine the number of families that all of a sudden had to forego dinner. Imagine a family of 5 or 6 seated together before an empty table. Imagine the number of children who all of a sudden had to stop school. Imagine a generation who have lost educational opportunities that could potentially set back the country's human progress in the coming decades. Imagine the number of patients in hospitals nationwide who succumbed to their cancer, stroke, infections just because they lost their financial lifeblood. Unfortunately, these are not just imagined. These are not just conjectures or assumptions, but realities that have become even starker and darker during this pandemic. These are real-life accounts and stories, and for sure, the reality of the struggles and plight of ordinary Filipinos are not unbeknownst to us, especially here at the University of the Philippines. In my 12 years of public service, I have seen the state of poverty not only in my district but also our nation. It is a systemic and intergenerational problem whose solution we have still yet to fully achieve. I have listened to the struggles that the urban poor communities face daily. We have worked with them in consultations about policy-based solutions that they need and in projects and programs that aim to alleviate their plight. In the same 12 years of public service, I have personally witnessed how well-designed social protection programs help them. I have seen how successful social protection programs have given our fellow Filipinos hope. We have, for instance, the Universal Healthcare Program, which guarantees equitable access to quality and affordable healthcare goods and services and protection against financial risk. We also have the Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino Program Act. The 4Ps Act is a national poverty reduction strategy and the Human Capital Investment Program that provides conditional cash transfer to poor households. More recently, and as a response to this pandemic, we have the Department of Labor and Employment's TUPAD, or the Tulong Pangkabuhayan sa ating disadvantaged displaced workers. TUPAD is a community-based package of assistance that provides emergency employment for displaced workers, the underemployed, and seasonal workers. Lest it be misinterpreted, the Universal Social Protection Floor does not mean that every Filipino will be rich in the end. No, because dignity is not directly proportional with wealth or material capital. Human dignity is much more than one's wealth or net worth. Instead, the Universal Social Protection Floor means that whether rich or poor, the Filipino feels the same security in his or her life, the same security for his or her family, the same equality in access to quality goods and services. Because from the stories and the lived experiences of real people, from our constituents and our fellow Filipinos all over the archipelago, I have realized again and again that many of us are but a few steps away from poverty. There is a very thin line between struggling Filipinos and the poverty trap. This treacherous thin line hides in the faces of many uncertainties and emergencies that none of us could ever completely anticipate. This anxiety, fear, insecurity is antithetical to human dignity. Isang sakit lang o hospital confinement ng isang mahal sa buhay na hindi mabayaran. Isang emergency lang na kinailangan mong mangutang ng malaki. Isang bagyo o malaking pagbabaha o mawalan ka lang ng trabaho. Maaari nang madagdagan ang gabundok nating pasanin at posibleng hindi na tayo makaalis sa kahirapan. I know this because my family has also been there. When my mother was hospitalized and had to undergo chemotherapy for her cancer, our family had to tighten up our grip on our daily expenses to get by. Hindi naman po kami mayaman, but we were fortunate to have some savings and be supported by people. But not everyone has this privilege or has access to information about existing government programs that could potentially help them. The Universal Protection Floor, therefore, is about leaving no person behind. It is about uplifting the human condition. The Universal Healthcare Act is an important cornerstone of the Universal Social Protection Floor. So too is the 4-Piece Act. But these are understandably not enough. The Universal Social Protection Floor extends to social insurance, social welfare, labor market interventions, and social safety nets. These components are the building blocks of social protection programs and often intersect in projects under the executive branch such as DSWD, DOH, and DOLE. On our end, we have filed House Bill 7178 in the 18th Congress to institutionalize the TUPAD program that has helped thousands of Filipino workers who have been displaced because of the pandemic. If enacted into law, this can also serve as a social safety net for millions more Filipino workers in the future. In the midst of these innovative social protection programs and services in the country, there remains a gap that needs to be filled. The pandemic has particularly brought to the surface not only the existing inequalities in society, but also the challenges that the country's social protection programs face. From a public administration perspective, many of our social protection programs remain scattered and fragmented to the point that target beneficiaries often overlap, or worse, remain not attended to at all. The institutionalization of the Universal Social Protection Floor has therefore been defined as a priority under the Philippine Development Plan for 2017 to 2022. In this respect, we are aided by the Subcommittee on Social Protection, an interagency group that involves experts from national government agencies led by DOLE and civil society groups. The subcommittee was created by the National Social Development Committee of the National Economic Development Authority in 2019. It informs the institutionalization of the social protection floor throughout the country, developing plans and frameworks and recommending policies and strategies for operationalization. As the chairperson of the Committee on Social Services in the House of Representatives, I have supported and will continue to support these evidence-based recommendations of the subcommittee. The development of a universal social protection floor framework should also situate the delivery of basic services in the context of our local government units. The role of the LGUs is especially important, and we have seen how dynamics with LGUs affected the implementation of the social amelioration programs during this public health crisis. Our constitutional setup, which favors the decentralization of services and respects the local autonomy of LGUs, compels us to work with barangays, municipalities, cities, and provinces. LGUs are central to the success of the Universal Social Protection Floor. They can be magnifiers or catalysts, or, in some unfortunate cases, roadblocks or stumbling blocks. The partnerships with LGUs must ensure that the former and not the latter is met. In this aspect, a participatory approach uniting many actors, duty bearers, and right holders is the only way to go. This discussion that we will have today is thus opportune. Through our webinar, we start the dialogues that will spark or reinforce movements towards policy reform. We become more united. Ultimately, together, we envision a Philippines known worldwide for its successful universal social protection floor, for institutionalized and sustainable programs and projects that ensure that every Filipino's dignity is upheld even in the direst of straits. This is a legacy that we hope to achieve for our children and the next generation of Filipinos. It is a legacy that will need incremental steps and progressive realization. In our path towards this, may we remain united and committed to our roles as caretakers of the Filipino people's dignity. Maraming salamat po at naway maging mas masigasig pa tayo sa paglilingkod sa kapwa nating Pilipino. Mabuhay!
Thank you very much, Congressman Vargas, for sending that video. Our next discussant is a faculty member of the UP National College of Public Administration and Governance, where he teaches public fiscal administration and public administration and the economic system. Currently, he is the director of the said college. Please welcome Assistant Professor Raquiza Flores.
Thank you so much, Veronica. By the way, just to clarify, I am the director of the Center for Leadership, Citizenship, and Democracy, one of the research and extension units of the National College of Public Administration and Governance. Chancellor Menso, organizers of the Pilipilunas Forum Series, our excellent presenters and fellow discussants, our dear participants, good morning to everyone. And thank you for inviting me to this forum. Let me now share my screen. Okay, so just to check, can you now see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you. So just to refresh us with regard to what was also presented by our speakers earlier, let me just share some points with regard to the overview of our social protection expenditures. So it was shown earlier also by Undersecretary Toledo that national government expenditures on social protection has been increasing in recent years. But as also Dr. Raquiza pointed out, it is still behind other developing countries. So other countries with GDPs that are even lower than the Philippines would have higher investments in social protection. And the bulk of this social protection spending goes to social welfare programs, including, of course, the top three, the Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino Program, or the 4Ps, the Kalahi CIDDS, and the livelihood and self-employed programs. There are other programs that also receive substantial investments on social protection, including the Department of Education's school-based feeding program, the National Food Authority's rice price subsidy and implicit subsidy, and the DSWD's also supplemental feeding program from WAPA. But we have realized, primarily because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and now the Russia-Ukraine conflict and its implications on the global economy, the need for massive expansion of social protection coverage to mitigate the impacts on the most vulnerable. I think, as mentioned also earlier, we should not only look into the situation of the poor or those who are under the poverty threshold, but also to those who are near poor or who have incomes that are near the poverty threshold because of their vulnerability to income shocks given these circumstances. So it's important to be able to know who will be needing social protection. The social safety net expenditures, on the other hand, were dominated by the DSWD's social pension program for indigent senior citizens. And social insurance has also been receiving increasing budgetary support, but still there's a need for to increase its relatively lower coverage. Labor market interventions contribute the smallest social protection expenditures owing because of their nature. Of course, we're talking about scholarships for internships, and also we have job fairs. So these do not require a lot of expenditures compared to the others. However, through the years, we have seen some persistent challenges in the implementation of our social protection programs. This includes, of course, the weak level of coherence at the national level of social protection programs, considering that there are a lot of agencies that are involved. So we really commend and welcome the initiatives from the Social Development Committee of the NEDA, of course, led by the DOLE, in coming up with a National Social Protection Floor program. So we see this as a very important step towards consolidating the different efforts in terms of promoting social protection among our government agencies. Another challenge would be the leakage issues. Dr. Raquiza mentioned earlier the problem, and also I think Dr. Ofroneo said something about this regarding the concern on exclusion of supposedly beneficiaries of our social protection programs, considering that there could be some problems in our targeting, in the completeness and accuracy of our database, for example. But another important issue would be the leakage issues. For example, in our National Health Insurance Program, and also to some extent to the 4-piece program of the government, wherein there are some beneficiaries that are receiving the service or the assistance, but possibly might not need this less compared to other households and individuals. And of course, they also mentioned the persistent challenge of securing sufficient budgetary support or funding for social protection programs. So this is a continuing challenge, but considering also the efforts of our civil society organizations to spread awareness for the need for more budgetary support, hopefully this could be something that we'll be able to address in the future. Initiatives being done, for example, by CSOs like the Alternative Budget Initiative, and also the budget tagging initiative being done by several agencies in the government, including the NEDA and also the DBM. All contributes towards, again, being able to let us know what would be the need for additional budgetary support for social protection. I think Chancellor Nemenso also mentioned his welcome remarks, the importance of these upcoming elections. And one thing that we can also do in terms of promoting social protection investment would be also to come up with reforms to ensure that the minorities and also the marginalized sectors are better represented in our House of Representatives, in the Congress, through the party list system. That goes without saying that we should continue leveling with our representatives, and we are very glad that Congressman Vargas earlier guaranteed his commitment towards the promotion of social protection investments and funding in the government. Now, there are also some lessons that we have realized from past experiences in terms of implementing social protection programs. And that this includes, for example, the improvements in the evolution, design, consolidation of programs of the same or similar objectives as was demonstrated, for example, in the DepEd's school-based feeding program, This was highlighted in the report of Jokno Sikat and Mariano in 2018. It just demonstrated how several programs that have similar nature, like in this case, feeding programs, can be consolidated into one big program that would have possibly more policy support and would have more efficient implementation. It is also important to be able to monitor and evaluate through audits and also impact assessments the effectiveness and also the outcome of our social protection initiatives, as this will also contribute to the support by our policymakers, our legislators, in terms of providing more funding to the program, but also this will somehow support the redesign and the reimagining of these programs for better implementation in the future. Some lessons from international experience have also shown that having a good and inclusive digital infrastructure, including, for example, internet connectivity, digital identification, being able to have monetary transactions through digital and online means, are also crucial, or at least important, in being able to adapt to circumstances of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is important in terms of ensuring the continuity of services, especially in transactions between the government and the individuals that could be moved online. So in terms of our way forward, considering these challenges, let me just point out some recommendations that our government can also consider. First, in terms of expanding formal employment opportunities, this is important since even as of now, our labor force and population is supposedly increasing or growing in a significant rate. And it is quite also puzzling to learn that we are having problems, for example, in terms of the level of funds that are still available for our social pension programs like SSS, for example, and social insurance like the PhilHealth. Now, within 20 years since our population have started decreasing, if you look at the data for the number of 0 to 5 and 5 to 10 year olds, it has started decreasing vis-a-vis, for example, those who are in the age range of 10 to 15 years old. So maybe in the next 20 years, we'll also be experiencing challenges brought about by this decreasing population, especially with regard to, again, sustaining our funds for social pension. So it is important that for the upcoming, for the succeeding generations, we'll be able to expand formal employment opportunities, and also ensure that our pension systems and also social insurance agencies would benefit from better governance and administration. It seems that I haven't, I don't know if I just missed it, but I was looking for the agricultural and crop insurance programs as part of our larger social protection scheme as presented earlier. And I think this is important considering that our agricultural sector still provides employment for a significant percentage of our laborers, of our population. And also they are hosting disproportionate, a larger percentage of those who are under poverty incidents. And we all know that agricultural processes, agricultural production would be very much vulnerable to climate change and also extreme weather events. And it is quite concerning to know that only a small percentage of our farmers are able to avail of agricultural insurance programs. In terms
Professor
of
Flores, may we
yes.
ask you to wrap up, please? We're out of time. Thank you.
I have just a few more slides, two more. So again, in terms also of ensuring better targeting, this is one of the challenges that we have mentioned earlier. We think that we agree with the World Bank, for example, that the introduction of the Philippine identification system could be a game changer in this regard. In fact, they have already started partnering with the SWD in terms of targeting, identifying, and also verifying its beneficiaries. However, we should make sure that the digital divide won't also dampen the effectiveness of using the PLCs in identifying our our beneficiaries for social protection. Again, we mentioned this earlier that both the poor and the near poor should be identified and targeted because the near poor are also vulnerable to shocks in income and also quality of life. Considering what you also said earlier with regard to the diffused responsibilities, the involvement of numerous government agencies in social protection, it might also help that we are able to review the mandates and functions of these government agencies to be able to promote more coordination and also minimize overlaps among their programs and projects. As also mentioned by Dr. Ofrene, it's important to pursue more progressive taxation, but we also think that tax collection and administration improvement would be of equal importance. I think it's also worth mentioning that pursuing more progressive taxation should also include looking at the taxation being done at the local government level, considering that there's not much studies show incentive for our local governments to collect the taxes that they have the authority to collect and administer. So I think that's also important, considering also that there was this recent Mandanas decision. We should be able to rationalize also the roles of the local government units in social protection. I think they can do a lot in terms of course, labor market coordination, coming up with livelihood programs, and also looking into other aspects of social protection like reproductive health and responsible parenthood programs, and also other targeted social protection programs, for example, for differently abled persons, and also indigenous peoples. And lastly, I would like to talk about calculating the economic and social benefits of also off-budget and tax expenditures on social protection. For example, the benefits that we derive from the minimum wage policy, the VAT exemption of senior citizens, and also other discounts for certain sectors. Okay, so these are usually not included in our budget, but to fully account for public investments and also allow for social cost benefit analysis and social accounting, I think this is important. So that's for me, and thank you very much for having me this morning.
Thank you very much, Professor Flores, for that interesting perspective. Our last but not the least discussant is a specialist on social protection at the ILO DZUP Work Team for East and Southeast Asia and the Pacific. He served as Social Security Specialist at the ILO Decent Work Technical Support Team for South Asia. He also worked as a security specialist at the ILO Sub-Regional Office for Southern Africa and at the ILO Sub-Regional Office for Central and Eastern Europe in Budapest, Hungary, and at the German Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. Please welcome Mr. Markus Ruck.
Thank you very much, Veronica. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for this invitation to this important panel. And it is indeed with great pleasure that I'm taking the floor to represent the ILO Decent Work Technical Support Team for East and Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And I would also like to thank the previous presenters for their comprehensive and lucid presentation. In my presentation, I would like to focus on the importance of social protection in the regional COVID-19 response and the trajectory towards recovery. And I would also like to say some words about regional priorities and policy options for further progress. Ladies and gentlemen, following 2 decades of strong economic growth in Asia and the Pacific, COVID-19 struck, sending a powerful reminder of the persistent and structural challenges faced by the region. With many countries not always able to convert economic growth into quality jobs and generate stable incomes, even before the crisis, 930 million workers in the region were working in various forms of vulnerable employment, for example, as own-account workers or unpaid contributing family workers. The region is home to 1.3 billion informal workers, representing 68% of the total workforce, most of whom work in poor conditions with no or very limited access to social protection. Gender inequality remains a central characteristic of labor markets, with women receiving lower pay than men and spending more time in unpaid care work. Despite progress in recent years and the increased attention devoted to social protection in the region, the stark reality is that 55.9% of the population still do not have access to any form of social protection. The current crisis has once more exposed the cost of having so large a percentage of the population uncovered, particularly those working in the informal economy. It is also important to note that social protection in the region needs to respond not only to the pandemic, but to other major trends as well, including population aging, migration, urbanization, technological progress, disasters, and climate change. The region was one of the first to be hit by the COVID-19 crisis and one of the quickest to respond. And indeed, many countries have responded decisively to the COVID-19 pandemic to ensure that people can effectively access healthcare while supporting jobs and income security for those most affected. Countries with more advanced social protection systems were much quicker and more effective in reacting, given the automatic stabilizer effect of existing mechanisms such as unemployment protection or sickness benefits and/or non-contributory mechanisms. Strengthening sickness provisions was an important measure to secure the income of those not able to work because of COVID-19 infections. Several countries also deferred, reduced, or subsidized contributions to social security schemes to ease the financial burden on businesses and workers during the economic downturn resulting from the pandemic. Overall, 73.9% of all social protection response measures were of a non-contributory nature, either building on existing schemes or introducing new provisions. Responses included increases in benefit levels to address the economic hardships caused by the pandemic, the extension of coverage of existing programs, the introduction of temporary schemes, and the distribution of in-kind benefits such as food, vouchers, and subsidies. To ensure access to affordable healthcare, many countries directed significant resources into the health sector in response to COVID-19. Measures were also taken to increase coverage and reduce barriers to accessing healthcare. Reflecting the situation existing in the region before the crisis, responses were in most cases effective in reaching those informal jobs and covered by contributory schemes, in some cases in combination with social assistance mechanisms. It is also important to note that those who were left behind were mostly people who were neither affiliated to social insurance nor poor enough to qualify for means-tested social assistance, the so-called missing middle. Ladies and gentlemen, the region stands at a crossroads. Countries can use the policy window priced open by the pandemic and build on their crisis response measures to strengthen their social protection systems and progressively close protection gaps. It is indeed time for countries in the region to make their choice between different development paths. The ILO advocates for the application of the high road strategy with a significant new role for social protection, setting out to be more inclusive and leaving no one behind, while supporting greater growth driven by domestic demand and contributing to further development of human capabilities. The other option is to focus on fiscal consolidation and pursue a low road approach that keeps countries trapped in a low cost, low human development growth pattern. Considering the nature of the reforms required, ladies and gentlemen, social dialogue needs to be at the core of the process. With strong participation by social partners, ensuring the involvement of both those contributing to and those benefiting from the system. Meaningful and effective participation by workers, employers, and other stakeholders not only helps to ensure that social protection policies respond to people's needs, it is also key to building trust, public support, and a sense of ownership, thereby facilitating the implementation of policies. Up to now, social protection has been, for many countries in the region, a residual element of public policy, mostly limited to supporting the most vulnerable, rather than a developmental tool to enhance both economic development and resilience. Only if it is recognized as an integral part of a renewed socio-economic model can social protection achieve the policy and fiscal space it needs in order to have a transformational impact on societies. Equally, by occupying more public space, more central space in public policy, enhanced social protection can support the social contract and generate public trust in the state with a positive impact on social cohesion. The provision of more inclusive and adequate social protection can also contribute to building human capabilities and enhance productivity, thereby generating conditions for the generation of increased government resources, both in terms of taxes and social security contributions, and thereby increasing the fiscal space for redistribution. Today's transformations require new adaptations of social protection systems to ensure that they can continue to play their protective role for workers already covered and expand to cover additional workers, while facilitating the transformation of economies and societies and creating a bridge towards a future that works for all. High levels of informality and the prevalence of new forms of non-standard employment require context-specific mix of traditional and novel approaches to ensure that all workers have access to social protection. Linking different policy areas and strengthening synergies between them can generate multiple positive spin-offs. For example, linking social security institutions with tax authorities would have the potential to generate new ways to extend coverage. At the same time, linking training and skills upgrading programs with social protection can help develop the productivity of workers and enhance their employability. Realizing the important role of social protection as a social and economic stabilizer, countries should seize this opportunity to make the human right to social security a reality for all. Recovery will only be sustained and future crises mitigated if countries move towards comprehensive, sustainable, and shock-responsive social protection systems. Social protection policies that enable people to better navigate life and work transitions, structural changes in the labor market, and systemic shocks respond better to the ILO's centenary declaration's call for a human-centered future of work and contribute to the achievement of the 2030 agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, while the COVID-19 crisis provoked an unparalleled social protection response, many countries are now facing a choice over the future of their social protection strategy. Both the ILO Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work of 2019 and the Social Protection Floors Recommendation number 202 of 2012 signpost a high road social protection strategy for all countries very clearly. Taking this high road will support human-centered recovery and help ensure a better future for all. Investing in universal social protection is the ethical and rational choice, the one that paves the way to sustainable development, decent work, and social justice. And on this note, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rook, for that very informative talk. We'd like to remind everyone again to please post your questions on the Google form provided in our Zoom chat box. We will be reading the questions during the open forum. Please don't forget to use hashtag Pilipilunas2022 in your posts about the event. Now we go to the open forum, and our first question is addressed to ASEC Avila. As mentioned earlier, local government units represent a good convergence point in delivering more efficient SP programs. Can you elaborate on that point and give some examples on how participatory approaches could be utilized in the local level to enhance the delivery of SP programs?
Yeah, thank you. I think this issue of giving the local government units to have a bigger role in the implementation of social protection programs was also mentioned by some of the speakers, particularly Professor Flores. I understand that government agencies plan to devolve some of their social protection programs, and I think the local government units, given their proximity to to target population, and with the additional funding from the national government, could deliver social protection program services in a more responsive manner. For instance, a livelihood program could be better implemented by local government units, as well as programs for the elderly, and including nutrition programs, etc. So I think the Mandanas-Garcia ruling gives us this opportunity to devolve some of the important programs relating to social protection.
All right. Does anyone else want to answer among our panelists? Okay, maybe we should move on to the next question, but this is addressed to Dr. Raquiza. Why is the term floor used for the social protection programs? Please unmute.
Basically, when we talk about the floor, as against, for example, the ceiling, what we are really referring to is the minimum requirements needed for an individual to live a life of dignity. So what is the minimum income security that one needs to be able to avail of the goods and services, to be able to live a dignified existence? And that is the beauty of the National Social Protection Floor, is that because it already talks about an ambition for our people to live a life of dignity, and it also provides the income security necessary, at least for health, for some of our basic needs, like along health, along education, and focused on the vulnerable sectors, like persons with, well, of course, persons with disability they are included. Those who don't have regular jobs, also senior citizens, children. So that is basically what we mean by the floor. But in the context of progressive realization, we want to expand, so that a greater swathe of our population are covered until it becomes truly universal.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Raquiza. And this is addressed to any speaker or discussant. Do we have enough businesses or companies that will provide work for those graduating colleges for the next 10 years? Kasi po, nakakabahala yung dami ng gumagraduate kada taon, pero dahil kaunti at mahirap ang trabaho, this leads to unemployment. Anyone?
Yeah, of course, I need to respond because I'm from the Dole. But we know that employment is a function of investments. And the strategy is for our economy to attract good investments to create good paying, productive, decent jobs. So I think the national strategy is, of course, to make sure that we encourage the the inflow of good investments that will create these jobs. In the DOLI, we used to call this income employment generating sectors, and this includes those sectors that have the potential to. It's not really easy to predict if we will have this number of companies to provide jobs and help lower the unemployment rate. But I think, as I said, the national strategy is for investments to come in and provide jobs that are decent and will enable our Filipinos to have a matatag, panatag at maginhawang buhay, as the PBP calls it. Thank you.
Thank you, Asek Avila. Anyone else who wants to add to that?
Si Dr. Rene Ofeneo.
Okay, salamat po. Actually, grabe ang krisis na hinaharap ng kabataan. And then, lalo na yung binanggit ko na matapos ang pandemya, pasok naman itong stagflation. But as pointed out by the last speaker from ILO, i-transform po natin itong social protection program as a development tool. And part of ng programa na yan ay yung tinatawag na job creation. May ginawa na po ang DOLE na tupad. Ang problem limited days, and then hindi maliwanag ang kung may nagagawa o hindi. You see, ito pong isang pinagsimulan nitong social protection program sa daigdig, yung ginawa ni Roosevelt noong 1930 sa Amerika. At the height of the Great Depression, ang ginawa ni Roosevelt, naglunsad sila ng public works program. Pag-aayos ng yung dust bowl dyan sa maraming estado sa Amerika, rural electrification, cleaning up of yung mga pathway, sanitation, etc. Creation of millions of jobs. And in this regard, napakahalaga ng papel ng public sector. Sapagkat in crisis time, mahirap pong very timid ang businesses. Pero gagalaw yan pag nakita nila gumagalaw ng ekonomiya, but they will not lead. And that's why at this time, mahalaga ang pangunguna ng public sector, which and therefore government. And that's why nga nagtataka kami, bakit in this difficult time, ngayon ka pala igigibain mo pa ang public sector. What do I mean? Nagpasa po tayo ng batas na binabaliwala na yung sinasabi ng Constitution na public utilities control at public services hawak ng gobyerno, open up. But you see, tingnan nyo nangyari sa kuryente, tingnan nyo sa nangyari sa tubig. Nagmahal, pero dumami ba ang trabaho? Gumanda ba ang serbisyo? So dito po magkakaroon ng rethinking dapat. So let us, itong social protection, bahagi ng ating counter-cyclical armament para buhayin ang ekonomiya. At in relation to this, binanggit po natin kanina, i-tweak yung build. Almost 1 trillion po ang ina-allocate ng government to help yung mga itong mga malalaking korporasyon, pagtatayo ng mga dambuhalong infrastructures. Mahalaga po yun. Pero in these critical times, unahin po natin ang infrastructure sa sinasabi kanina ng ating professor sa NCPAC, sa community, yung COVID-proofing, climate-proofing, at pag-ayos po ng mga community centers. Labor-intensive po yan na hindi naman kinakailangan malalaki ang gasta. Millions of jobs can be created. Can you imagine if you can develop a multi-purpose community center na pangunahan pa nga ng kababaihan in every impoverished barangay all over the archipelago? Ang laki pong tulak sa ekonomiya, ang laking katiwasayan ng ating archipelago. This is what I mean. There should be courage on the part of economic planners. Magbago sila ng sistema kasi yung ating present system parang mag-intay sa manna from heaven. Ano yung manna? foreign investment from somewhere. Open up the economy, liberalize, deregulate. In the meantime, naghihirap yung ating mga magsasaka, bumabaha ang mga imported. We should rethink and re-strategize development. Salamat.
Anyone else? Thank you, Dr. Rene. Anyone want to add to that? Yes, Professor Flores.
Anyway, I would just like to give my 2 cents worth to answering the question. I think first I would like to agree with Asek Avila regarding the relationship between investment and employment. So what is crucial now would be promoting the level of investments in our country. Of course, we're not just talking about foreign direct investments, but also investments being made by our local entrepreneurs. But investment and by extension, job creation is also a function of the availability of infrastructures. Of course, the policy environment should be conducive. And also it is very important related to what we're talking about this morning, that we're able to also promote human capabilities. Because investors would like to, of course, get their money's worth. They would like to have value for money. And they will not locate, even our local investors for that matter, where these important elements or ingredients are not present. But having said that, I also would like to echo what Dr. Pineo also mentioned, that we are now living in an environment or circumstances that would really be challenging, considering that there might not be much appetite for indirect investments. And given that, I think what he mentioned with regard to the importance of the MSMEs, community level investments in infrastructure, in human capabilities would be very crucial. And I think considering that the government has also already invested a lot with the build, it might now be time for also the same level of investment on human development. So maybe what we need would be alternating investments on human development and also physical infrastructure. So that would be crucial for this upcoming election. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Flores. Yes, Dr. Raquiza.
Yes, I would just like to say that when we talk about universal social policy and including social protection, if we want to really make it transformative, it is located within a broader development paradigm where you also have economic transformation. And what does that mean? It means that we are able to move our economy from low productive to high productive. So we are increasing productivity within the agricultural sector, within the services sector, and within the industry sector, no? Especially the manufacturing sector. Because what our goal is to be able to create high productivity jobs, high value jobs, because that is how we will be able to increase incomes, produce quality, improve quality of life if we are creating decent work. And you know, as has been mentioned by Dr. Afreneo, it is so important, no, that we build our domestic industries across these sectors for that to be generated. Which is why medyo disheartening yung ilang mga recent laws that just recently came out, because rather than helping, in a way, it serves as additional barriers for many of our domestic industries to thrive and flourish. Kaya yung sinasabi din na, you know, when during the period of the Great Depression, President Roosevelt came out with the New Deal to be able to create jobs to get the economy back. The UNCTAD actually is suggesting something similar. But in the context of climate change, what is now being proposed is a Green New Deal for developing countries. The need for the government to stimulate local economies. But in the context of climate change, let us use green and clean technologies. So ganun na po ang mga discourses natin. And this is what we want the kind of practices that we would like to see, of course, together with working with CSOs and local communities. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Raquiza. Here's another question. Given that many non-poor but just above the poverty line families will slip to poverty given economic shocks, shouldn't social protection floors also consider effects of inflation? And shouldn't Congress or the UF be convinced to suspend the implementation of some trade policies because of their effects on the already stretched incomes? Anyone? Yeah, yes, Professor Flores.
Yes, I agree with the importance of that question or concern. I think right now there are some initiatives on the part of our government to be able to index a lot of our policies to inflation. And that would include also our income tax policy. There are, of course, other policies that could also benefit from that. But before this was quite challenging or difficult to do. But again, with the advancements in information and communication technology, this is something now that we can really incorporate or take into consideration in reviewing the impacts of our policies and also its effects on the livelihood of our households. So I guess that's in a way one way of putting it.
Yeah, we have a follow-up. The train law removed the provision of tax exemptions that are based on the number of dependents, i.e. children and persons with disability, and instead replaced a uniform exemption level applicable to all without regard to the differentiated household burden of caring for children and PWDs. Do you consider this a step backwards in achieving social protection floor objectives? Yes, anyone?
Can I answer?
Yes, Dr. Raquiza.
Yes, definitely. I would consider this a step backward because it does not take into account the differentiated capabilities and vulnerabilities within households. So having that earlier measure of providing additional tax exemptions of certain vulnerable individuals within household is actually a form of affirmative action. And taking that out, again, ignores the inequalities within households. So in a way, that is a step backward.
Anyone else? Okay, we have another question for Dr. Rene Ofreneo. Okay. How can we make taxation more progressive?
Well, thank you for the question. I already mentioned kanina po, una, regressive po yung ginawang the last two tax measures, yung train at saka itong create. And favorable po yan sa mga big companies. And the assumption naman ng mga economic managers na parang supply side economics ba na bigyan mo ng layang yumaman ito mga ito, lalong mag-i-invest at lalong mag-create ng jobs. Eh mukha yata hindi naman po nangyayari yon. So what we are saying now that we are in a very bad situation, yung pong mahalaga yung progressive taxation. Ang ibig sabihin ng progressive taxation, siyempre, the higher the capacity to pay, the higher the tax. At yan po ang sistema by the way, sa mga bansa na very strong ang social protection, na kuminsan tinatawag pa nga natin silang welfare state, and reduce ang inequality. Now, yung pong yung nangyayari sa public sector na binubuksan natin yung mga public utilities na nagbibigay supposedly magde-deliver ng basic public services, kung pwede po, alisin, i-restrict ang participation dyan ng mga malalaking korporasyon because ang tendency nila ay talagang cherry picking yan eh. Kukunin nila ng profit. Gamitin nila yung talino nila sa pagpapayaman sa pag-build up ng mga factories. If you'll notice ang pattern ng development ng Pilipinas in the last 4 decades, habang nililiberalize mo yung ang market, ay nag-aalis sila sa industry, na binabanggit ni Maribik, nagpupuntahan sila doon sa madaling magpagkakitaan, kuryente, tubig, etc. Bahagi rin po yan ng sinasabi kong kinakailangan progressive yung economy. Now, while I have the floor, may I add one last point. Ito po sitwasyon, napakahalaga sa next president, mobilization of the country. Kasi yan po this is in relation also sa sinasabi ni Professor Maribik, yung having a social contract and a Green New Deal, mobilization of the country, mobilization ng sambayanan para bumangon ng ekonomiya. Hindi yung mobilize yung isang abstract na foreign investment na according to UNCTAD, hindi naman darating in this uncertain time. For example, we have OFWs remitting $36 billion a year. Ang laki-laki po yan. I-capitalize mo lang yung 10% or even 5% into program. Malaki. Pero ano pong ginagawa nila? Nagbabalikan sila, nagpupunta sila sa IKEA, nagtatayo ng mga bahay doon sa mga developed areas na ayaw nang bumalik sa kanilang mga respective na impoverished communities. In other words, lalo na heighten and inequality. Pero pwede naman silang itulak through solidarity action, through mobilization. Magkaroon po ng overall frameworks. That's why I keep saying po, i-review ang development blueprint. Ngayong panahon na ito, tama-tama kung magpapalit ng presidente, ito ang malaking hamon sa kanya. Ilagay sa mas sustainable path ng development ang Pilipinas.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rene. I'm sorry, Mr. Rook you were raising your hand earlier.
Yeah, I raised my hand earlier because I wanted to respond to this question, the nexus between social protection and employment. And I wanted to add to the discussion that the UN has recently launched a global accelerator on jobs and social protection for a fair transition, aiming to create 400 million decent jobs worldwide, including in the green, digital, and care economies, and to extend social protection coverage to the 4 billion people which are not covered so far. And the ambition is really to bring together the member states of the UN, the international financial institutions, the civil societies, the private sector, and of course also the social partners to really build back better, from the situation where we are in now after the pandemic, and also to keep the promises of the 2030 agenda and to accelerate it. This is why it's called accelerator for jobs and social protection. So the UN has really recognized the need to do this, and of course also the complementary of employment and social protection. So that's what I wanted to add. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rook. We just have one last question. And this is for whoever wants to answer. What message do we impart to the rest of our citizens or people on their role to support the achievement of objectives of the National Social Protection Floor? So your message to the nation on what the ordinary citizen can do in order to support the achievement of the objectives of the National Social Protection Floor. Anyone? Yes, Dr. Raquiza.
Well, of course, I would like to defer to Asek Avila as our government champion, who has been working very hard on this for several years. And then maybe I can just add to what he will say.
Yes, Asik Avila.
Thank you, Dr. Raquiza. I think it's important to convey the message that every Filipino has a stake in the establishment of the National Social Protection Fund. Of course, we saw in the presentations and the discussions the challenge of institutionalizing the floor, primarily because of financial constraints. But ordinary citizens can help advance the cause of the National Social Protection Floor by perhaps talking to their political leaders, communicating the importance of the floors in making sure that no one is left behind, that those in the margins of development are able to participate in policy-making, decision-making processes of their localities. So I think, those advocacy and awareness-raising campaigns perhaps could convince our political leaders to take, to have that political will to find a way to finance in a sustainable manner the social protection fund. Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, Dr. Raquiza.
Yes, maybe just to underscore what Asik Avila has said, we in civil society and academia and other stakeholders have worked with the interagency body led by DOLE and populated by other agencies who really believe in the social protection floor. And this is work that has been ongoing since the last two administrations. No? Hindi lang itong Duterte administration. I understand the initiative occurred even earlier under the Aquino administration. We have been wanting to let this proposal come to life, no, so that it gets full support. But we are always told that it's a great idea, it's a good idea, it's inclusive, but where is the budget? No? But there is not enough fiscal space, there is fiscal constraint. And yet, as we have seen in the case of the CCT in the Philippines, and we have seen in the experiences of other countries, there is really literature that says that fiscal space is a matter, or provide fiscal spending for social services, for social policy, is also a function, no, of the policy framework and values and priorities of our policymakers. In other words, if they think it's important, if it's attuned, aligned to their priority, the resources can be generated. Like in the case of CCT, the first 5 years of CCT, thereabouts, we were borrowing heavily from the World Bank and the ADB to finance the CCT to the tune of billions of pesos. No? And it dramatically increased from hundreds of millions. Within a year, it became billions. And it was going on every year, up and even before there was an impact evaluation that was being undertaken. How effective is the CCT? Wala pang evaluation, but because our policymakers thought it was important, the funds were being generated. So we have seen that if the political will is there, it can be generated. And even if right now in the context of the pandemic, there is a real economic hardship, we can do this through progressive realization. We build our institutional capabilities, fiscally, administratively, in terms of technical competence. What is important is that the political will is there and the vision is clear. So, one of the reasons why we prioritize the National Social Protection Floor here in UP for the Pilipiluna webinar is because for the next administration, no, we would want the NSPF to take a more central role in their political and policy radar. Kasi lagi siyang hindi nakikita, wala tinitingnan ng mga policy makers in spite how inclusive and how transformative it is. So we really hope that with some webinars like this, we hope that the political and policy attention will finally give it its due.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Raquiza. And that's all the time we have for the open forum. We would like to thank all our panelists And we'd like to remind all those who wish to get an e-certificate of attendance to this webinar, please don't forget to answer the evaluation form. The link for the evaluation form will be posted in the chat box after the open forum. At this point, we'd like to call on Associate Professor of the UP Department of Psychology, College of Social Sciences and Philosophy, and Director of the Office for the Advancement of Teaching. He's a member of the UP Task Force on a Blueprint for Building the Nation, which organizes the Pilipilunas series. May we call on Dr. Antonio Clemente for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Ms. Veronica. Kamusta po? Alam ko inabot na po tayo ng tanghalian, pero sana kahit papaano po ay nabusog ang ating mga isip, puso, kaluluwa dito po sa napakasiksik, liglig at umaapaw na discussion natin ngayong umaga. So maraming salamat po for choosing to join us this Monday para sa handog po na ito ng Pilipilunas 2022. Muli po, we would like to thank yun pong convener natin at isa sa mga naging speakers natin si Dr. Raquiza, and of course all our speakers, Dr. Rene Ofreneo, Yusek Rolando Toledo, ASIC Alex Avila, Mr. Marcus Rock, si Representative Alfred Vargas, Assistant Prof. Harry Sadel Flores, at syempre po kay Ms. Veronica Jimenez, who did an amazing job moderating our webinar today. So kung may pagkakataon po, palakpakan natin sila, pasalamatan kung nasan man po tayo ngayon, kung saan man po tayo ngayon located. No? So panghuli na lang po as we wrap up our conversation, siguro po ang dami nating take-home points ngayong umaga. I'd like to share with you just two very quickly lang po. Yung una po, actually, mas tanong, kayo po ba, pagkatapos niyo pong marinig yung mga natunghayan natin ngayon, namumuhay po ba kayo ng marangal? Kung oo o hindi, bakit po kaya? Ano yung meron o wala kayo? Yung very striking po sa akin ay to live a life of dignity is to be free from constraints. Para mabuhay po tayo batay sa buhay na hinahangad natin. Para mabuhay po tayo ng marangal, dapat hindi na natin poproblemahin, sabi nga nila, yung mga basic o yung mga minimum na bagay. Healthcare, education, income security. Paalala rin po ito na ang buhay ng marangal ay para sa lahat at hindi lang para sa iilan. Yung pangalawa po na natunghayan ko sa mga narinig ay magastos mabuhay ng marangal. Kaya yun pong naging mas malinaw ay hindi talaga natin ito kakayanin mag-isa. Kailangan po tayo tulungan ng ating gobyerno para marating po natin yung buhay na pinapangarap natin. Tao po ang sentro ng social protection programs at investment po ito ng gobyerno sa atin. Interesting po kasi ang ganda ng metaphor ng isang floor, di ba po, ng isang sahig. Kapag bumagsak ka, may sahig na sasalo sa'yo. At hindi ka makakarating sa second, third, fourth floor kung wala itong basic na tinutungtungan natin. Kung ang Pilipinas po ay isang malaking bahay, kailangan yung gobyerno natin ay titiyakin na meron tayong sahig na matatag. Yung hopeful po ay pinag-uusapan siya. Narinig naman po natin, pinagpaplanuhan, ginagawa ng paraan ang pagkakaroon nitong social protection floor. Yung isa po sa mga emphasis na narinig natin ay yung policy coherence between the economic and social frameworks toward a more transformative future. Yung hindi kalat, malinaw yung tunguhin, marami pang sectors yung madadamay, at madaming kailangang magbago. Sana po dumating yung panahon na yung pag-uusapan natin, hindi na lang basta floors, meron ng usapin ng social protection escalator, social protection elevators, multiple floors. Na darating po yung future na natuganan na natin yung mga basic. Kasi yung nakatuon po ngayon, kung narinig natin, feeding programs, mga ayuda. Pero yung mga mapagpabagong programa tulad halimbawa ng pagkakaroon ng living wage, mahaba-haba pang laban. Sana dumating nga po yung panahon na yung pag-uusapan natin ay yung thriving na. Yung lalong pagyabong, pag-angat, paglago. Kung mabalikan po natin yung title ng webinar series natin, Pilipilunas. Yung idea po ay isa sa maraming paraan ng recovery o paglunas sa mga problemang kinakaharap natin ay ang pagpili ng tama ngayong darating na eleksyon. No? Kaya kung babalikan po natin yung pinakita sa ating framework ni ASEC Avila, yung kailangan matiyak po natin ay at the core of it, pinapahalagahan natin sana at ng mga susunod nating iboboto yung pagiging rights-based, no? Yung karapatang pantao, pagiging inclusive na lahat kasama, kung hindi man kaya, maraming kasama. Kung mahirap pa rin po yan, at least malinaw kung sino yung dapat nating unahin. At yung pagiging transformative. No? So, tignan po natin yung mga programa, suriin natin yung mga past action ng mga tumatakbo. Makinig po tayo sa mga speeches na binabanggit nila. No? At their core, naririnig po ba natin na prinsipyado sila, and by that we mean they are rights-based, inclusive at transformative. No? At dahil mukhang ang sinasabi po at isa sa mga natutunan natin ngayon, kung ito yung core ng pinahalagahan nila, ay susunod, no? Itong social protection floors na pinag-uusapan natin. So bilang huling paalala na lang po, no, bukod po doon sa pag-like sa ating Facebook page, yung Pilipilunas 2022, yung pag-subscribe sa ating YouTube channel, pagsagot po sa ating evaluation forms, yung susunod po nating webinar on industrial policy ay mangyayari sa March 22, no? At yun pong inaabangan din natin na magaganap sa April. Isa po sa mga proyekto ng Task Force Nation Building ay ang one-day policy dialogue with our presidentiables, kung saan ipapakita po natin, ipaparinig natin sa kanila yung governance agenda na nabuo po natin dito sa serye ng Pilipilunas 2022. Muli po, maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat. Sana masarap po ang ulam ninyo and enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you po.
Maraming salamat po, Dr. Clemente. At abangan po natin sa March 22 itong susunod na Pilipilunas webinar will be about industrial policy. And that ends our Pilipilunas 2022 webinar. Hopefully, this webinar has enlightened our viewers on the importance of achieving a truly effective national social protection floor in the Philippines. Thank you to all who joined us. I'm Veronica Baloy Jimenez. Everyone be safe and have a great day ahead. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks, Veronica.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.